Thank you so much, Pep, and thanks to everyone for being here. I see some thumbs up, so hopefully you can hear us all right. We are here to talk to you today about some practical ways to apply storytelling principles for B2B SaaS companies and how to kind of fill that gap and hopefully not be bullshit or suck ass, as Pep just said. So first, we'll get to a few introductions of who we are. I'm happy to introduce Kevan. He is my co-founder at Bonfire. Over the past 15 years, he's been building brands from 0 to 1. You might know him from little companies like Buffer. I don't know if there's a chat active, but here are some things that he would love to hear your thoughts about in the questions as well. So you can see what he's interested in there.
Amazing. Thank you, Shannon. And I will introduce Shannon, so my co-founder at Bonfire. At Bonfire, we help brands with their storytelling. So glad to be sharing this with you all today. Shannon has a wonderful background in the arts, so freelance writing, dramaturgy, script consulting, you name it, and then has gone in-house at some really big and special brands like Dashlane. We work together at Oyster. And yes, in the chat, please shout out any questions you have about musical theater, Hulu shows, Super Salad. Like, we'd love to keep engaging with y'all in the chat, and excited to share with y'all. So what we have on tap for the next 30 minutes or so is this agenda. So we're going to start off by explaining what is brand storytelling. Let's define it for y'all. Then we're going to jump into how to quantify the impact of storytelling, and then the unquantifiable impact of why that matters just as much as the stuff you can measure. We're going to give you some practical, tactical tips on how to create your brand narratives and how to apply these across your different channels. We'll be talking about several examples throughout, and then excited to get your questions answered at the very end.
Great. So to kick us off, I'm just going to do the standard thing. We're going to define what we're actually talking about when we say brand storytelling. And this is the definition that Kevan and I use at Bonfire. Brand storytelling is the creation of narratives that are uniquely true to you, told in uniquely resonant ways, consistently over time, in order to build an emotional connection with your audiences. And the things that are really important here are that they are uniquely true to you, so they are differentiated from your competitors, from the market. They're told in resonant ways, so that's where creativity, the creativity angle can come in. They're consistent over time, meaning it's not every month to month or every campaign you're switching up these stories. You need to give them a little bit of time to kind of marinate, and that can be a key factor in building trust with your audiences as well. And then finally, the whole goal of this is to build an emotional connection. And we're going to talk more about building that emotional connection in a bit. But this is what we mean when we say overall the concept of brand storytelling. And the big gap that we see with B2B companies is that it's a hurdle to get to that emotional connection because there is often a space, like an air gap, between the big evocative pieces of your brand story, like literally your brand story or your purpose or your vision or your mission or your values, these big kind of nebulous, ambiguous, creative and inspirational pieces. There's a gap between those and bringing them down to earth, making them bite-sized, making them super relevant to your audiences. And then also, how do you think about the best ways to apply them across touch points, across channels, and at different points in your funnel? So I promise we're going to show you a framework later in this presentation for doing exactly that, for kind of translating the big ideas into what we call brand narratives. Yeah, we will get to it. But first, over to Kevan to talk about measuring this stuff.
Yeah. One of the challenges that you might feel too with investing in brand storytelling is, well, what is the impact going to be for this stuff? And so we're going to talk about quantifiable impact. This will be a short section because you actually can't measure brand. Just kidding. You can measure brand. You can measure it. It's actually something you can measure a lot more easily than you think. You can measure a lot more than you might think. And so let's run through a few different examples of what you can measure. Then we'll give you some tactics and some tips on how specifically to measure these things. So when it comes to measuring the quantifiable impact of brand storytelling, first and foremost, you can measure your brand awareness and the size of your audience. Secondly, when it comes to things you can measure, You can look at your customer loyalty and the sentiment about your brand. So how are people feeling? What emotional words are they using when they talk about your brand? Third is going to be differentiation. So measuring how different your brand appears in the market. And then fourth is going to be your conversion rates. And I know a lot of growth marketers and demand gen folks will be happy to see conversion on this list too. Yes, you can actually tie brand storytelling into conversion. We'll get to that in just a second. So with these four being the things you can measure, how you measure them. So starting off with aided and unaided recall and brand reach. These are ways to measure your brand awareness and the size of your audience. So when we're talking about aided and unaided recall, this is going to be a survey that you send to folks within your target market, folks within your customer base, folks within your audience. When we talk about aided recall, this is what you're seeing here on the left-hand side of the screen. Which of the following brands have you heard of? You list a handful of brands. Your brand is one of them. Give people a chance to answer that. Aided recall, you're basically giving them the answers and seeing how many they recognize there. And then unaided recall is going to be an open-ended question. When it comes to X type of brands, what comes to mind first? And then they're going to be listing brands in that space there. So that's the unaided recall side. And when you're measuring this, you're measuring to see where do you stack up relative to your competition? How does this trend over time? And so if you're running brand campaigns, you want to see that awareness trend up over time. It's also really interesting to understand, like, how do you fit relative to people's conception of your category or your space? When Shannon and I worked at Oyster, for instance, we were a global employment company. We helped companies hire people from anywhere in the world. When we asked people the unaided question of what global employment brands come to mind, a lot of people said things like Indeed, which is a hiring platform, like a job market, not something we did at all. And so it's really helpful intel to understand what do people associate with your category? Where do you fit? Where does your brand fit within there? Then on the right here is a spreadsheet that Shannon and I have used to good success in past roles. This is a brand reach tracker. So this particular screen you're looking at here is kind of the aggregate view of how are you trending according to your goals. We like to do like a 100%, 85%, 70% trend lines. And so you can see where you track throughout a quarter or throughout a cycle. Other sheets in this tab will then break it down channel by channel. So you can see how far are we growing our reach and impressions on social media? How are we growing reach and impressions on PR? Like the handful of brand channels that you're running, you would track them in here and you aggregate them all into this spreadsheet here. If you would like a copy of this, feel free to shoot us an email. Our email address is hello@aroundthebonfire.com. Happy to give this to y'all as a free resource to play around with. So this is how to measure brand awareness and your audience size. Next is measuring your customer loyalty and your sentiment. And I'm sure some of y'all are familiar with some of these measurement tools. First, we have NPS. This is the traditional NPS question here. How likely are you to recommend X product to a friend? Scale of 0 to 10. Ideally, you're having people answer 9 or 10 here. There's typically also an open-ended question that follows this of why did you rate us this? Really helpful to get that qualitative feedback on what people are saying here. But this is going to measure satisfaction. And then next, you can also measure this through your sentiment analysis, whether it's a tool like Brand Tracker, anything you have on like a mention.com, those things will measure sentiment. You can also do it through surveys. These surveys are run through a company called Attest. Their website is askattest.com. We love sending surveys to them. It can be questions like, given everything you know about this company, what do you think their key message is? What words come to mind when you think about this brand? You can start to associate different emotions and values to the brand messages that you're putting out there. Then third on the list is differentiation. And how do you measure differentiation? Well, in a B2B context, this is often measurable through, again, surveys, but competitive win rate and win-loss analysis are going to be two of the best sources that you'll have for actually measuring these. And so how often do you win versus your competition? And when you're doing the win-loss analysis, what are people saying about your brand relative to the competition, and how differentiated are you in those conversations? And then last is conversion rates. And this is where it can get either super complicated or you can hack it together and still get some good insights. So if you want to go the super complicated route, incrementality testing is huge. There's some really big and robust tools that a lot of big companies use. They're typically quite expensive and a little bit hard to set up, but they exist. What I like to do instead is to do a lot of pre and post testing. And so it's a form of incrementality, if you will. It's like, what were the numbers before you did this brand campaign? what were the numbers after. You can also do something called a holdout test, where you're running a brand campaign, for instance, in a particular geography or on a particular channel or for a particular audience, and then comparing that group, holding out that group and comparing it to your baselines everywhere else. So there are ways to actually measure how does brand impact conversion rates. I'll pass it to you, Shannon, for the squishy stuff.
Yeah, the squishy stuff. So this is the part where we talk about the importance of emotional connection, which, unless you want to have some big consulting firm on retainer at all times doing qualitative surveys, is a lot harder to measure. And I have this quote here from the Harvard Business Review about the importance of emotional connection. The most sophisticated firms are making emotional connection part of a broad strategy that involves every function in the value chain, from product development and marketing to sales and service. And just because you can't necessarily measure exactly the number of the emotional connection that you're making, you can still impact the emotional connection if you understand how storytelling works. And so what you can't measure may actually matter more, which is either very freeing or very frustrating, depending on which side of the marketing department you sit on, I think. So here's our first thing that storytelling can really help with. Stories are remembered 22 times more than facts. And so when you want to talk about attention and memorability of your brand, getting and keeping attention, investing in brand storytelling is an excellent way to do that. People remember stories more than data because it provokes an emotional response, and we remember things that we feel more deeply. And it also can often have a cause and effect response, which helps cement it in our brains a little bit more. Secondly, customers who are emotionally connected are 52% more valuable than even the next tier of engaged customers, which are highly satisfied customers. So there's a big gap there. And so storytelling can also help you with persuasion and influence, because unlike data and specs, narratives communicate your values. And so if a story aligns with your values, if it aligns with your beliefs, it is more likely to influence behavior and decision making. Next thing that storytelling can really help with is creating a sense of identity, of belonging, and of social bonding. So whenever we create a sense of identity, we are making our companies, our products, our brands even stickier. According to the Harvard Business Review, there are 10 high impact emotional motivators that companies can use and can use for making emotional connection. And a sense of belonging is one of the top of those emotional motivators. And finally, storytelling is important because telling the same story everywhere, showing up as the same personality everywhere, creates consistency, which establishes trust. And building trust across communications is a huge differentiator over time. And again, a big driver of customer loyalty. So we are going to move into the how portion of our presentation, and we're going to talk to you about how to actually translate the big fuzzy stuff into something more useful for your teams. And we call those brand narratives. And we define a brand narrative as an expression of your company's history, purpose, mission, and values. All of these things overlap to varying degrees, and they could be at different times more or less relevant. So depending on what you do, depending on who your audience is, depending on the stage of growth you're in, your business goals, certain of these aspects are going to be more or less relevant to pull stories from. And also their importance very well might change over time, as you can imagine. So if we look at this visually, we might think of, okay, these concepts that you likely already have established somewhere at your company overlap in various ways. But if you think about it, they might be of differing importance. So these, and also the areas where these circles overlap are going to be increasingly unique to you, because no other company should have your exact same brand purpose, company mission, brand values, company history. And so if you can pull ideas and narratives and stories at these intersections of all these different ideas, you're going to get stuff that's that's much more likely to be differentiated and creative. So over time, you might imagine that when maybe you have a really, really compelling founder story. And so like that's what you're going out with when you are trying to raise money, or your seed company. So earlier stages of growth, perhaps brand values at a certain point become really important when you're trying to differentiate yourself against, for example, maybe you're a company that cares a lot about sustainability, but your main competitor doesn't. And so your brand values are something that you really want to showcase at a certain point in time. And whenever we think about defining what these are and aren't, I think this is a really helpful thing to keep in mind. So we're going to walk through a framework of how to create them, but at a high level, brand narratives are holistic. So meaning that unless there is like a super, super specific case, these are not going to be separate standalone stories that are unrelated to each other. And while not every brand narrative is telling the whole story all the time, all of them together are communicating the entirety of your brand. They're also generative. So that means that they inform and inspire marketing, content, and communications work. They aren't like a fixed thing in and of themselves. They are used to guide and inspire. They're based on insights. So those are insights about your customer, your audience, your market, research, interviews, surveys, all of that. Really great places to start rather than a hunch about what the most compelling stories will be. And kind of what we were saying, they are a translation. They make actionable your more overarching brand story into marketing applications. So to me, they take what's theoretical and they make it concrete. And then on the other side of this chart here, they aren't exhaustive. They're not everything you will ever need to say about your brand across every touch point. They also aren't fixed. They should evolve over time, not so rapidly that you don't get traction in the market with any one story, but they should track with changes in your positioning, in your business strategy, in your audience. Big, more strategic changes like that, your narratives will also shift over time. They also aren't repetitive. So a well-crafted narrative will allow for lots of different expressions of itself versus there's some verbatim story that you're retelling, copy pasted across blog, across social, across thought leadership, etc. And finally, they aren't the same as your brand purpose. Like we said, they're a way to translate that purpose into marketing in a narrative and evocative way.
Awesome. So this, I think, is going to be the section where a lot of this starts to take shape and come alive, and you may be able to even think of how this could fit within the companies that you all are running and working on today. One way that I tend to think of this too, if you think of the difference between an Airbnb and a Vrbo as an example. When I think of Airbnb, I think of words like belonging. When I think of Vrbo, I think of words like almost like luxury. When I think of Airbnb, it's a lot about experiences. When I think of Vrbo, it's a lot about vacations. And so ways that companies apply this framework that we're about to get into will dictate and drive you down a certain brand feel, a certain brand position, certain brand story. So let's start with the overall view here, then we'll dive deeper into the tactics of how you bring this all to life. So this is the brand narrative framework that Shannon and I have used with other brands. It's what we use when we're consulting with companies and marketers at our business, Bonfire. And it all starts with this overall brand story. It's kind of the umbrella across everything. And this brand story is going to be this intersection between some moment in the culture, some cultural touch point, and then the best version of your brand. And that overlap is where your brand story exists. And typically we'll phrase this in a way where it sounds like, we believe the world would be a better place if blank. Then that sentence becomes like your overarching brand story that everything else will filter down underneath. And so specifically these narratives, I think, is where it's really interesting for us brand marketers and where it becomes much more tactical. Like Pep was saying, like the storytelling books are great in theory, but this is how you put it into practice when you are an operator within a certain brand or team. And so we like to think of 4 narrative types that exist underneath your brand story. When you're coming up with these narratives, you may end up with 3 to 5 for your company. These are going to change a bit more often than your brand story will change. So they're on different timelines in terms of the way that you're going to iterate on them. But these narratives are going to be a category narrative, a product narrative, a narrative about your persona, or a narrative about the culture at large, the mission, the impact that you want to have in the world. And so these 4 narratives, or 3 to 5 narratives, whatever you end up with, these are going to be the things that keep your story consistent across multiple channels. And that's where the touch points then comes in. So it is channels, but it's also like any touch point that you could have with your brand or your company. If you think of something like gifting, like is gifting a channel? Maybe, maybe not, but it is a touch point nonetheless, and it can be a touch point that comes back to one of these narratives that you have created. So this is the overall framework and view. Let's dive next into like, how do you actually make this happen? So what are the inputs into this process? So we tend to think of it across these 3 different buckets: foundations, feedback, and research. And if we start with our foundations on the left here, there's going to be 3 different ones that we tend to pull from. And these are going to be like your company-wide foundation. So what is your company's purpose? What is your mission? What is your values? So the purpose is a statement around why your brand exists. What world do you want to see? What world do you want to create with your business? Your mission is what you will do to create the world that you want to see. And then your values is how you're going to pursue your mission and your vision. Oftentimes there's a distinction between brand values and cultural values within the company. And so it's important to make sure you're considering the differences between both. Some of the cultural values is going to be how you operate and work together as a company. Your brand values are going to be more about how you are experienced in the world as a team, how your work, how your pursuit of your mission and vision feels to the market. So starting with your foundations, then you layer on some feedback. And this feedback is going to be the key stakeholders involved in this brand narrative process. So when you think about who owns brand within a company, it's kind of a tricky question. Like technically, probably the head of brand would own it, or the brand marketer would own it. But there's so many different people involved in the creation and shaping of it. And then the entire company is involved in helping to bring it to life. And so it really does need to feel like there is ownership across the company. There's likely going to be like one person, one team that is the key shepherd of the brand. But when it comes to the feedback in this process, these are the types of roles that you'll want to involve. And so definitely C-suite and founders, you'll want to involve your brand team and your content team, especially for B2B SaaS. You'll want to involve someone from the product side because they will have a lot of that product vision. What is your brand's best self? And then we found it to be really important to have your ICP in the conversation if you have your ICP within your company. And so for instance, if there are certain marketers at Winter working on brand, they should be involved in the brand narrative conversation. If there are social media managers at Buffer, they should be in the conversation around Buffer's brand narrative. If there were people ops professionals at Oyster, our global HR platform, like you would want them in the conversation here too. So include those folks, build the feedback loop. And then the third bit of information you want to include in here is going to be the research side of things. And so there's typically 2 buckets. You can think of them as like internal research and external research. So external research, what is the culture and the market doing today? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? What's happening? This can be like trend spotting, it can be market analysis. A lot of times sources like G2 can be interesting to see what trends are happening. Forrester, those kinds of things can be really helpful. The Gartner reports, understanding where are things moving. Then on the audience and customer side, so within your circle, like what are people thinking, feeling, reacting to? Personally, I found Winter to be really helpful in this particular bucket because you can get that research out on like what is messaging that's resonating today, what are people thinking and feeling about your website, your marketing materials. So use your research tools to get that insight into your audience and customers as well. So with these 3 buckets of inputs, then you take these and you create your narratives. We'll get to some narrative examples here in just a second. What these narrative examples then do is they can be inputs back into the brand strategy document that you have, your channel strategy, your messaging, positioning, identity, your personas. Like these narratives filter back through all these other assets that you would create as a brand marketing team and create within your brand storytelling universe. Awesome. And so these are the 4 different types that we talked about. So category, product, persona, and culture. And with these four, the way to think about each of these, so a category narrative, what is the story about what's differentiated about you in your category? So if you're in an existing category, you might want to think, well, what is differentiated about us? If you're starting a brand new category, how do you define that category? What narratives are important in the process of defining that category? When you think of a product narrative, what are the narratives enabled by the benefits of your product? What's the impact of your product? So especially if you're disrupting a category or disrupting a certain product line, like what is unique about your product in that case? What is the core value of the product that you can build stories around? A persona narrative, what are the narratives about your customers that you're helping them to achieve? How are their lives improved with your product? What stories can you tell that your brand is enabling on behalf of your persona? And then the culture one is more around what does your brand have to say about this current moment in time, about the zeitgeist? What is the impact you want to have in this moment? What is your mission? What is the social impact? Think about the culture at large and how you want to play a role in the conversations within that space.
Yeah, so thinking about what does this look like actually in practice, right? Because we say brand narratives and it's like, well, what is a narrative? Is it a 5-page thesis paper? Is it a tweet? What are we talking about here? We found that this structure is really helpful for making the narratives actionable for people who are actually executing day-to-day communicators for the company. So the structure here is a short sentence or paragraph, and then 3 to 5 proof points for why it's compelling for each narrative. So here's an example of a client of ours that's a map making software. And here's an example of their product narrative. So again, it's what is the impact of the product? And this story is called The Transformational Power of Maps. And we say like really explicitly, this story is about what is actually being accomplished right now when maps are used in the transformational collaborative way that our product enables. This story appeals to GIS professionals in particular verticals and to the mainstream public, so as so many of these applications have environmental, political, or social implications. So as you can see, this is not language that is meant to be copy pasted anywhere. It's kind of like a holding container, an inspiration for the types of stories you could tell. I can imagine giving this to a content marketer and them reading through this and seeing at the end, applications of environmental, political, social implications. Okay, I'm getting my wheels turning about the types of stories that our brand can tell about our product's impact. So, and then again, of course, there would be product specific proof points for how that is. Case studies are a great example. Any stats that you might have about the impact of your product, things like that. Here's a second example. So this is from our the global employment platform that Kevan and I worked at, Oyster. This is our persona narrative at Oyster. So the impact, how are we making our personas' lives better? And what were doing at Oyster was we were giving people ops professionals a seat at the table. And this story goes something like, people ops deserve an equal voice at the executive level. We're here to champion the great and important work from people ops and to elevate their place in defining company direction. And so you can see that this could inspire things like, oh, maybe we'll feature like a blog every month of a people ops professional that's doing something really exciting in their field. You know, that's not necessarily, you know, that's kind of like down the road from like what this is, but you can see the holding container again that some of these stories could be inspired by. And a third example of a category narrative, this one you might recognize from Buffer, where Kevan worked. Modern day businesses can grow through social media alone. And the story is that social media management software gives businesses big and small a channel to connect directly with their audience, to be authentic with the brand, and to build connection and sell later. So again, we are setting the foundations that are going to give your marketing team the ideas and the direction they need to execute on these stories, but more importantly, execute on them consistently and tell the same stories over time.
Awesome. So there's some great examples of what these stories look like. And then Shannon was even referencing like, what are some ways that we can bring these across different channels? And there's a few different, I guess you could say, principles that we think of when it comes to this, like why this is important. So first and foremost is this is going to help you be consistent. I think I saw this in the comments, like consistency with these messages is really important because you're talking a lot across a lot of channels, and the messages that you're saying are really critical to building that trust piece, some of the immeasurable stuff that Shannon referenced earlier in the presentation. Next is going to be this idea of it is an ecosystem, not a fire hose. And so we don't want to just like spray and pray with all these messages. We want to be smart about how we are applying these messages in the right place, in the right time across the entire ecosystem of our brand on all the different channels and touch points that we have. And then the third point here is going to be about this is different channels and narratives are for different people and places. And so we'll get to this in the next slide also, but just this idea of you don't have to put every message in every single conversation. That would obviously be a really weird / long conversation to stick all 3 to 5 narratives into the same one. And so be smart and be strategic about where these different channels and narratives fit together. And so there's a couple different, they'll look like diagrams. You can think of them as frameworks, matrices, whatever you want. These are how we think about applying these across the funnel, for example. And so if you think about a funnel being broken down into top, middle, and bottom, some of your narratives are going to make more sense at different spaces in this funnel and across the journey than they will at others. If you think of something like a cultural story, that's going to probably be more of a top of funnel story because it's going to be very expansive in thought. It's going to be ambitious. It's going to be aspirational. It's not going to necessarily be the best for converting and driving hard ROI from. And so you can mark this in the diagram like this. If narrative number 1 is culture, yes, maybe top of funnel is green, middle funnel is yes, and it's a maybe for bottom of funnel. You can think of something like a product narrative, much more tied to the actual value that you get once you click that sign up button. So those could be more often seen at the bottom of funnel or later on in the customer journey. So you can think about how do these different narratives fit across different sections of the funnel and then chart it in the diagram like this. You can also think about how do these different narratives fit across the different channels that you have. So just an example, there's 4 here: website, email, social, PR, and comms. If you think about the different altitudes of the narratives that we're telling, they're going to make more sense or less sense on each of these different channels. The website is probably going to have a big swath of different narratives on it. There's going to be like your homepage one, your overall brand story, but then you can sift through the different customer journey stages on your different pages and drive deeper narratives there. Something like social media or PR and comms, those are probably going to be more of your aspirational stories and narratives. And so you can think about like PR and comms. It's great. Let's stick the culture story there. Social, it could be something where you experiment, since things tend to be a bit more come and go with the messaging that you put there. So you can test on social, try a number of different narratives, but think in a channel perspective also when it comes to putting your narratives out across different channels.
Yeah, and we'll get to just a few examples that we've pulled. Again, like Kevan was saying, it's an ecosystem, not a fire hose. So you can't expect for every single touch point to be telling the whole story every time. So we've pulled little instances that we can observe just to point out where some companies are doing narrative in a really smart way, and some companies are maybe missing an opportunity to do narrative. So I chose to compare and contrast 2 AI-based note taker apps. One is more like of a meeting integration. One is more just for like a kind of like AI-powered like Evernote or Notion. But anyway, the AI space right now is so crowded, and it's so difficult to tell the difference between different note taker apps or different photo editing apps or whatever. And so narrative is a really great way to make an emotional connection and differentiate yourself in a space that's like really crowded and noisy at the moment. So we have reflect versus superpowered here. And I'm not saying that either of these approaches is necessarily the correct approach for what their goals are at this moment, but I'm going to show you an example of how narrative is being used in one and is not at all being used in another. So as you can see, you're comparing the homepage hero headlines here. Think better with reflect. Already we're talking about the benefits. This is like a persona benefit statement here. And just to note, often product positioning is really deeply rooted in what the value is to the persona. So I think there's a lot of really good overlap between what your positioning is in the market and what your persona stories are. So if you're looking for a good starting point for what does your persona care about. You can maybe look at your positioning. So anyway, you have think better with reflect versus very descriptive, very straight down the barrel, it does what it says on the tin, the AI note taker for your meetings. Cool. I get it. I get what the product does. Do I necessarily know exactly what it's going to do for me? Maybe not. The subhead here, notes with an AI assistant. Okay, now we're layering in a bit more of the understanding on Reflect from a Reflect, whereas Superpowered goes with Superpowered supports every meeting platform. Again, straightforward product claim, right? Further down the homepage, what can you do with Reflect AI? Again, asking me to think about how my life will get easier, better, is improved with Reflect. And it's probably pretty small on the screens, but you do have some like listing out of features there. Whereas on the other side, we have Superpowered that just says features and tells you exactly what the features do. And then finally, even something like pricing can be an opportunity for a little bit of narrative, a little bit of storytelling, a little bit of communication of values, right? So here, Reflect is saying, we like keeping things simple, one plan, one price. Ooh, I also like keeping things simple, Reflect. That's good to know that you care about this. At least you purport to care about it on your homepage. Okay. Whereas Superpowered, pricing plans, you need to see the prices. Great, you've got the heading pricing plans. So that's just a compare and contrast of using narrative and communication of value and evocative language to try to make an emotional connection.
Great. And the next example we have is from Loom, and I'm going to try to answer Athira's question there in Livestorm. So great question on like, what is a good benchmark to study to understand a brand narrative done well? I think Loom is a great example. And this particular one here that we're looking at is their category story around differentiation. And so if you think about the trajectory of Loom as a business, it started off as a very like commoditized screen recorder was kind of the messaging. I don't even know if they thought about it as a narrative at the time. But some of the work that they've done over the past years is to really drive home these narratives around video messaging for work. And you can see some of the research that has gone into this particular phrasing and particular narrative. And so there's a lot of this like cultural zeitgeist research that you can see here. So the way remote teams communicate is awful. Meetings are boring, calls drag on, emails don't have any personality. And so it's addressing this cultural tension out there in a way that has created a new category. They've been very specific about what is involved in this category. It's again, some of the basic screen recorder functionality, but they have extended it into notes. They've extended it into collaboration. There's a bunch of different ideas that they've baked into this overall narrative. And then the output, of course, they got acquired for, $1 billion+ and things. So I think there's some really valid proof points in the Loom story and then a great example to pull from with how they're bringing these narratives to market.
Yeah, I'd also like to talk about Vecteezy. This is an interesting one because I found a case study that was written by their branding agency. And so in a rare moment of transparency, we could actually see the sort of brand DNA of Vecteezy. And it really struck me how much that they were focusing on their persona story in their overall brand. And with things like, for those who heed the call to create, one thing is certain, the creative journey is never a straight line. Like, this is a very emotionally resonant call of community and belonging and support for creators. And I was really interested to see how this would come to life on their homepage. And so when I went to their homepage, I was a little bit surprised that the hero headline here is download free vector art, stock photos, and videos. And, the slide before that I just showed you is not the entirety of their branding work. Of course, that was just like the kind of main headline from it. But we're going with a really straightforward product message here for the homepage. And if you think about how many different stock sites there are, I'm not sure that this claim really differentiates them from, say, Shutterstock or Death to Stock, or I can name 5 more off the top of my head. And you really don't find this we're for the creators narrative until much further down the page when there is a little bit of a nod to the best creator community online where you can then, explore. And so I think that it seems like what they've chosen to do is they've chosen to really double down and tell that persona narrative, perhaps in their community exclusively. And like maybe they hit it really hard there. But when you have this kind of disconnect, like say someone came to Vecteezy through the community first, maybe, or got introduced or got an invite to the community, then there's this a little bit of a remove, and it's a bit of a jarring journey to try to navigate around to these different customer touch points. And that can either just not reinforce memorability and consistency, but it can also sometimes break trust depending on how large the gap actually is.
Awesome. Then our last example here is Launch Darkly. And this is an example of a product story, but it's the product story told strategically across that channel matrix that we had talked about earlier. And so they're bringing to life this product narrative through an event in particular. This is a virtual conference. There's a developer day, which helps connect with the persona. They're inviting thought leaders, expert speakers. They're doing hands-on experiences. They're doing a bunch of stuff for this persona. You can see even from the messaging on here, the next frontier of DevOps. And so they're trying to paint this aspirational picture of what is coming, what is in the future. And so this is a neat way to think about, we have this persona story, we have this product story that we're telling to this persona, so this product narrative. What are all the different channels that we have in our control? What are all the different touch points across the customer journey? And they've chosen an event channel in particular. They've chosen this kind of like top to middle, a funnel place in the journey to get people interested and get them involved so they can tell the story in a very strategic location. And with that, I think we're down to our Q&A if we have time left for Q&A. Thank you all for listening. If you want to have any questions for us over email too, our email address is up there, but happy to take some live here with y'all.
Let's do this. Thank you so much, guys. So we have a bunch of questions and we'll see how many we can get through. So I'll start off with one of my own questions, which is the balance of what it is messaging versus, we connect human minds with, spiritual messaging. Now, if you're Salesforce, everybody already knows what you are, and that's exactly what they do. They're like some sort of a vague emotional statement there. They might or might not. If I'm a startup with my first 100 customers, nobody has ever heard of me, and I go there, I'm connecting, the real creators with their purpose. They're like, what the fuck is this platform do, right? Like I see this in winter messages all the time where people are impatient with if the messaging is not on point, specific. So how do you balance that? Thoughts?
Yeah, Kevin,
I think it's a tricky one. I think what we're kind of talking about is product positioning, copywriting. There's some different elements of how you bring these narratives to life that are represented in the website and things like that. But typically what you're going to look for is that product narrative, like what is the core value that you're providing to the users, and then you can communicate that a number of different ways. You can communicate it very tactically, and we do this so that you can have this. You can do it a bit more aspirationally into this is how you'll feel when you use us. And oftentimes those decisions will fall down to what does your persona most resonate with? Do they resonate with a more touchy-feely message? Do they resonate more with a practical message? Like if you're marketing to a DevOps space, it's probably going to be more practical and practical. If you're marketing to designers or creatives, it might be a bit more emotional. So it kind of depends on your knowledge of your persona in that case.
Let's take these questions in the order of. So if you want your question answered, people upvote for your favorite one. So this is a related question. So does brand storytelling translate to product messaging and product marketing work in general?
Yeah, also a good question. I think there's my preferred way to do it is you start with your brand messaging and then your product messaging comes out of that. Ideally, your brand marketer and your product marketer are working really closely together. If you're super early stage, your brand marketer and your product marketer are the same person, and so you're very, very close together. But if you start with that overall brand story, I think your product positioning then comes out of that space. Like for product positioning, you're talking about who you're for, what specifically makes you unique and special and differentiated. And that needs to tie back into the why you exist, first and foremost. And so I think it starts with the why, starts with the bigger brand stuff, and then it informs the product stuff from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree, because also, as a startup, as a small startup, who you go after as an ICP, it's not like you decide and day one and now that's how it's going to be. It's evolving all the time. What gets you to is from 0 to 1, and then you expand and you change your product, and then you learn that they actually don't want to buy this, they want to buy that. So could it also be that sometimes why we exist changes because we're understanding that our initial idea for why we exist, people don't want to buy that. Like there's no money to be made there. This is another failed startup. So
yeah. Definitely. And I think in that case, you're talking more about changes to the mission and possibly the purpose. But I would encourage that kind of really foundational DNA level work up front, including values. And so even if your purpose is changing because you find, oh boy, we took a really big swing on product market fit and we were wrong, or oh wow, we made this thing and actually these people over here really love it and people we thought don't love it, whatever. So then even if you're evolving your purpose, even if you're evolving your mission, if you have those values from the very beginning, then there will be a backbone that you can continue to point back to no matter who you are. And potentially you might find that backbone has to change, and then what happens then? And then that's like a really big exercise. But I think especially for a company that is small, for a company that is kind of relying on the motivation and the interests of the founding team, having those values that everybody agrees on is really key and will help things not feel quite so chaotic all the time.
Jessica is asking here, so an age startup, a B2B startup, should they focus on a narrative in the 0 to 1 phase, or how much of it?
I'd say yes. I'd say, we advise 3 to 5 narratives. If you're super early stage, maybe you have 2 narratives, maybe you have 1 narrative. Like, I think you can scope it down, but it's really important that you are as consistent as you can be, given what we just discussed about how often you have to iterate and experiment and evolve. But how consistent can you be about the stories that you want to tell, and then just reduce the number of stories given the resources and constraints you likely have.
Because here's what happens a lot of the time is people are surprised by their own success sometimes, or they're surprised by how quickly they end up moving. And then honestly, like it becomes like flipping rocks later. Like, where are all the different places that we've communicated as a brand? And oh my God, we said that on that website and this thing is still live and I didn't even realize. And so I think a lot of small organizations don't realize actually like how much flack they're throwing off as they are like getting going and as their trajectory is building. And it just becomes a really arduous exercise to try to retract all that and make it consistent afterward. So you're never too early for the really foundational stuff, we think.
There's a question here about how to connect these different stories together across the funnel and so on. So if you're just a solo founder, I created my mission, whatever, I know what the answer is. It's easier. Like now, if your team is bigger, freelancers, so where does all of this live, and what format? Is it a 27-page document, a fancy PowerPoint somewhere, or like in very cloud do we make sure everybody knows what the message is, and then is there like a consistency police, like, hey, don't post that because it's not aligned with whatever?
Yeah, it's usable or it's useless. Like if people can't use it easily, they are going to completely disregard it. If you need communicators throughout the organization to use your brand guidelines, those brand guidelines cannot get in the way of the other business critical things that they're doing. And so whenever you're creating guidelines, you're tailoring them to the use cases, needs, skill levels, and familiarity of those teams. So someone like a customer support, customer service team who is interacting with customers all day, they are a brand touch point. They're going to need something much different than what your content marketing team, what your PR and comms lead is going to need. And so I think it's just being really, really sensitive to what people can actually use. And I think the best way is like truly to ask them. And, you know, I think for your marketers who this is their bread and butter, you can dump the 27-page beautiful PowerPoint on them, and you can say like, this is the DNA of your next content strategy, like go forth. But for someone with like customer service and support, it might be as simple as suggested like greetings and sign-offs. It might be words to use and words to avoid, things like that. And as far as the brand police question, I think Kevan has a really nice point of view on how that happens.
Yeah, I tend to think of it more as brand shepherds, which is kind of a kinder way of approaching it. And I think it's a way that prevents people from being scared to go and bring the brand to life. We don't want that. Like, we don't want people to be not living out the brand values and not being proactive in extending the brand. And so how do you build that safe environment for people to feel like they can do that? I think it's this idea of shepherding rather than policing, so they're not feeling like they're going to get their hands slapped all the time, and then inviting them into that process too. I think you can do brand reviews together. You can have people bring you ideas and examples and be like, what do you think? Is this on brand? Is this off brand? Have a conversation, like involve people in the process, because your people are the ones who are actually going to be the ones bringing your brand to life out in the world.
AI and brand, where people are using AI more in content creation. Let's leave the judgments aside here. So how can we make it practical in this case, and in terms of story consistency or other ways?
Yeah, we could have a whole workshop on AI and brand. I think it's a big topic. I think there's an AI angle of it helps you be more efficient, and so there's that aspect of how do you use AI within your existing brand systems to create content at scale or to move things along. I think there's that aspect of it. There's the other aspect of like, they don't need to be mutually exclusive either. Like, I think you can bring a creative mindset to the way that you use AI. There's lots of great tools out there that can help extend your brand. We worked at a company that was using Midjourney for some of their illustration and photography work. There's a huge world of creativity that you can bring in there. And so I don't think it's one or the other. I think you can do a lot of things in tandem there, but it can be, I think that the thing to avoid is that you solely rely on AI to come up with all these brand things for you. Like, I think that needs to be human first.
Yeah, and when you're talking about the differentiation angle, which is what brand is a differentiator, and often in like a commodity market, brand is the only differentiator at a certain level. And if your content looks and sounds like everyone else's content because everyone is using AI, then you've lost the human touch. And consumers are smart, and they're getting savvy, and more than they're getting savvy, they're getting suspicious. And so I think things that really showcase the creativity and the human angle, even if they're being bolstered by systems that are supported by AI for like higher volume stuff, the big touch points, the things that are going to be evergreen, definitely want to have human fingerprints all over them.
I have a question about brand tracking surveys, like measuring awareness and consideration and things like that. No, this in consumer world, right? This is done all the time. Consumer companies have been doing it since forever. In B2B SaaS, it's extremely rare. Some of it is because, who is a big brand? HubSpot makes sense to do it. I started my company yesterday. I mean, there's no market to, for me yet. So nobody knows it exists. So when are you big enough to actually do brand tracking where enough category buyers would even know about you that the trend lines, make sense?
Yeah, it's a great question on timing. I think it's a question of timing, and it's a question of company business strategy. So for instance, if you're at a company where you're in a highly competitive market and you are goaling yourselves on how do you compare from a brand awareness perspective against your competitors, you got to be measuring it. And that could happen, Series A stage. It could be happen whenever you have the time and resources to go and do that. I think it's important to understand, where do you stand relative to your competition in terms of the minds of consumers, and how is that trending over time? If that is a company goal of yours, is to be competitive in that space. Otherwise, I think it's okay to wait to do the more robust surveying until maybe you're at a Series B stage, like a 10 million and above ARR stage, because you'll have more resources to go and do that. These types of surveys typically happen on a longer time horizon also. And so it's like a quarterly or twice a year type survey to get time for your brand stuff to bake and to have those results actually show up in the survey. And so if you're typically working on different time horizons when you're at a Series B or 10 million and above, and if you're before that, I would say just be a bit extra scrappy with it. Maybe do like a Twitter poll, or do something really small scale, just so you get a sense of it, or bake it into the existing research that you're doing for your customer base. Regardless if you're doing it in one-to-one interviews, like have you heard of us before, and build that sense. Like it's more about building an intuition of where you stand at the early stage, and then once you get past a certain stage, then you can be more disciplined about it.
Boom. All right. Well, thank you so much, guys. Everybody here, give Kevan and Shannon a follow on LinkedIn. They're posting good stuff. Drop them an email to get that sheet they mentioned. So thank you again, and I'll see you on the internet somewhere.
Thank you, Pep.
Thanks,
This
Pep.
is great. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, guys. And this is then the end of this session for everybody else too. If you want to do brand tracking with consumer audiences, I think there was a recommendation for getatest.com for consumer research. If you're a B2B brand, Winter is the only game in town for brand tracking service. In fact, GetAtest is a customer of Winter as well. So thank you, everybody. Peace. See you later.